Thanks a lot for inviting me in this distinguished audience and big room. So I'm going to talk about prospects, outlook for global economic growth throughout the next 35, 40 years. Global growth is an extremely fascinating topic. It is growth, economic growth, that throughout the last 30 years has dragged hundreds of millions of Chinese people out of poverty, giving them access to education, health care, heating in their houses, etc., etc. Looking forward, economic growth will drag millions of people in India out of poverty, in Africa, and also increase our living standards. It also comes with a cost, an environmental cost perhaps, but for the guy or woman who has been dragged out of poverty and can afford a meal a day, it is certainly very important. Okay. I'm going to talk about global economic growth, but the way I'll do this, I'll start showing you these two numbers. I'll make a small pause so that you can reflect on what these two numbers represent. Is the PIN code to my iPhone, or the iPhone of my wife, the second one? Is the PIN code to my safe in my hotel room? Is my birthday? No. This is what some people call the global PIN code. So in very rough numbers, what this shows is that today, 2015, we are around 1 billion people in the Americas. There's around 1 billion people in Europe. There's around 1 billion people in Africa. And there's around 4 billion people in Asia. It's a little bit more. We are 7.4 billion in the world, but in rough numbers, this is what it is. In 2015, there will still be around 1 billion people in the Americas. There will still be around 1 billion people, a little bit less in Europe. There will be more than 2 billion people in Africa, and there will be more than 5 billion people in Asia. So from today and throughout the next 35 years, we will be more than 2 billion people more in the world, and they will all consume. There will be firms that will be investing. They will provide economic growth. Just this simple fact, there will be more people in the world. This is of course important because it matters something for energy usage, and I will come back to that. So the plan, and if you remember these two numbers when you leave today, then I'm happy. Because then you learn something. The plan will be that there are two sources, very overall and basic, there are two sources that drive economic growth. The first is the growth in the population. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Then the second is how much do these people produce? So we could call it GDP per capita, we could call it productivity. When we know something about what's going to happen to the global population, when we know something about what's going to happen to global productivity, and then we know something about what's going to happen to total economic output in the world throughout the next 35 years. And when we then talked about that, and then we can say what that will imply, potentially, for energy usage and oil consumption. So that's the agenda for the next now, it says over here, 16 and 15 seconds, and it counts down. I have a counter over here. So for the next 16 minutes, that's the agenda. Okay. So overall, starting with population growth in the world, overall will be more people. So what I show you on the left-hand graph, I show you the world population figures in 2010, 20, etc., up to 2015. And in 2010, we were around 7 billion. And in 2015, we will be something like 9.7, something like that, with the rough figures as I showed you on the previous slide. At least as important is what I have on the right-hand slide, or right-hand graph, is that yes, we will be more people in the world, considerably more people, but the growth rate with which we will be more people will also clearly decline. So throughout the last 10 years, the average growth in the world population was a little bit more than 1%, and you can see how it declined. So when we come to 2050, the average growth rate in the world population will be something like 0.6. So it will be more people, but at a slower increasing rate. Where will population growth, where will that take place? You have annual growth rates in population in the world, in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. And what you certainly see is that for all countries, all regions in the world, the trend is, as of today, that the population growth rate will decline. It will be positive in all areas except Europe. In Europe, we will remain more or less the 700 million we are today when we look 35 years out. But in the other regions, population growth will increase, but at a slower pace. Just to take with the highest, Africa, right now they're growing at 2.5% per year, and it will be something like 1.8% per year in 35 years. Okay. Be more and more people at a slower rate. Why do we become more and more people? Yeah, in Europe we don't produce that many children. That's a sad fact. So what happens is that we live longer. So we are living longer. So that's what I show here, the medium age. That's the age where the 50% of the population that's below. In Europe it's 40, and there's 50% of the population that's above. That will increase in 35 years. It will be around 46 years. In Africa, they are around 20 years medium age today, and that will be around 28 years in 35 years. So it's an increase of 50%. What this implies is that when we get fewer and fewer children, and which is in particular do in Europe and in Asia, yeah, then there will be more elder people per young people, if we call it like that, people in the productive age. So we cannot just say that when population growth, there will be more production, because a large reason of this growth in population is because we get older. I hope you have a good pension. In Europe at the moment it is so that, on the right hand side graph, in Europe at the moment it is so that when there is one above 65, and then there are 4 between 15 and 65. So for each 100 between 15 and 65, there are 25, as you see on the graph, that are above 65. In 35 years, when there are 100 that are between 15 and 65, then there will be 50, only 2 per pensioner who can provide production and so on. The fastest increase in this is in Asia, where there are now 11 for each 100 between 15 and 65, and there will be around 30. So we're more people in the world with a slower rate, and we'll be older, which is obviously a good thing. I hope. So that's the first thing. Next thing is, how much do these individuals on average produce? So one thing is to know how many individuals there will be. How much do these individuals on average produce? That's important when we want to say something about total economic activity. This is perhaps the saddest figure I can show you today. What this shows you is for Denmark. We are in Denmark now, so here's one picture for Denmark. This shows you the average growth rate throughout the last 10 years, going through time, of real GDP per capita, per inhabitant, per person in Denmark. So if you look at the very first data point, so very much to the left, what it shows is that on average, each year between 1948 until 1958, so that 10-year period, GDP per capita in Denmark increased with 2% per year. When did we really grow in Denmark? The economy really grow in Denmark, and that was during the 60s. During the 60s, throughout the 10 years during the 60s, GDP per capita increased with more than 4% per year. Since 1970, it's just going back. So productivity has slowed considerably in Denmark, which is obviously an issue we talk about at the moment, and for the last 10 years, we have actually had negative real GDP growth. A lot of this is obviously impacted by the crisis, so when we're 10 years ahead of the crisis, it will rise automatically like that, but it will probably remain low, and it's of course a big issue. It's a big issue in all developed countries, in all advanced economies. So this is not just something that is particular for Denmark. It's very low right now in Denmark because we were hard hit by the financial crisis, but looking out around the world on advanced economies, productivity is slowing down. There's a very famous economist who's dealing with productivity growth and growth in the economy. It's called Robert Gordon. He has collected this data that goes back to 1300. Go back to 1300, and his point is, and what you're seeing is GDP per capita growth, annual growth rate of GDP per capita, and his point is that the growth rate we have seen in productivity and GDP per capita since 1950, since Second World War, was just a small historical incident. It was a good one, but what we are used to see in economists is very, very low productivity growth. And what he is fearing, and he's very respected, what he is fearing is that we will remain down there in advanced economies because we have invented the car, we have invented the internet, etc., etc. Of course, there are economists that disagree and say we will invent new things, drones, and what do I know. but this is an issue that people talk about. Okay. If we now look a little bit ahead and not look only at advanced economies, then there will be, for many of the emerging and developing economies, there will be high productivity growth. They come from a lower living standard, so they will catch up to the living standards that we have, and they will have high productivity growth. Here are lots of countries, but if you look to the furthest to the left, you see a country like India. Throughout the next 35 years, so this is as of today and up until 2050, throughout the next 35 years, the Indian GDP per capita, which is closely related to productivity growth, will increase by something like 4 or 5% per year. And in India, there are around 1.3 billion people. This matters a lot. In China, we always talk about growth rate in China is going down. And yes, it is certainly going down. It's much lower than 12% as it was a couple of years ago. But looking out the next 35 years, most realistic estimates say China is the third pillar, as you can see, and it will grow with something like 4 or 5%, 3 or 4%, something like that. The world GDP per capita will grow with around 2.5% per year. Denmark I've also indicated with a yellow column, and it's something like 1.8%. And we are actually not doing so incredibly bad as we sometimes are told. Okay. So, the world population will grow with something like 0.5 to 1%. 1% now, 0.5% in 2015. Per capita GDP will grow with something like 2.5%. Several of those additional people in the world, they will be older, so they will not produce. So the total GDP in the world will not grow exactly with 2.5 plus 1%, or it will grow with a little bit less. Estimates say that world economy, this is the total world economy, throughout the next 35 years, will grow with something like 3% per year. So it's not so that there will not be growth. There will be 3% per year on a global basis. It's not going to be where we are. It's not going to be in the Eurozone. That's something like 1.5%. It's not the rest of the OECD countries. It is in particular India, China, Africa, etc., etc. And again, so there will be growth, but it will be at a slower rate. And that's what I show on the right-hand graph. You see growth, but you see total growth be at the slower rate. So right now it's around something between 3 and 4%, and it will fall to something like 2.5% in 50 years' time, due to lower productivity growth in the advanced economies and due to lower population growth in general. Okay. This is an important thing, graph. This shows total economic output in the world. And in 2015, that's where we are now. 2016 we are, of course. 2016, total economic output in the world was $70 billion. There are some technical things here because we produce in euros. So when we want to calculate everything in dollars, we need to exchange something with an exchange rate, and their price levels can be different and so on. So you convert with this with what you call PPP, or purchasing power parity exchange rate. So the reason why I'm saying this is, depending a little bit about who you ask. Do you ask the OECD? Do you ask the Euro Commission? Do you ask IMF? There are slightly different numbers here, but the picture I show you, the broad tendencies, everybody agrees on that, of course. So total production right now, or this year, is something like $70 trillion. In 2050, total economic output will be something like $180 trillion. Some of this will be due to people driving in cars, heating their houses, energy usage. And I come to that, of course, in just a second. Okay, but this is important to remember. The world economy will be something like 2.5 times bigger in 50 than what it is today. All right. Again, where will it take place, all this? Yeah, it will take place in China, it will take place in India, it will take place in Africa, etc. So here's another graph just showing how this will affect individual countries. So we have the US, where their output at the moment is something like 16 trillion US dollars. You have US as the red one going forward, and then you see China taking over as the world's largest economy. In this particular calculation, in IMF, they have already taken over China, but we're talking few years here. China will or has already taken over, depending a little bit on the technical details in these calculations. It will take over and massively overtake US, and India will be catching up. All right. Now, what I've told you now is there will be growth. There will be lots of growth in some places, but it will be at a slower pace. What will this growth imply for energy usage? When I made this graph first time, and that was actually a couple of weeks ago, I was struck by how close the relationship is between world economic growth and growth in world oil consumption. It is very likely that you have seen this, several of you, before, and wow, but I was struck by how close this relation is. The correlation, if anybody is interested, between these two lines is above 0.8. It's very high correlation. So we clearly see that when global economic growth goes down, oil usage go down. This is also in real terms, this is millions of barrels per day, and then on an annual basis, of course, and growth rate in that. Then oil consumption goes down, and when the economy goes up, or the growth rate goes up, the oil usage goes up. And of course I knew that, but I had not seen that the relationship was so close. What you also see is generally the yellow line, or whatever it is, orange or whatever it is, which is growth in the world economy, is always more or less above the growth rate in oil consumption. So on average over this period, the growth rate in the world economy over these 50 years has been 3.3%. Also a good number to remember if you ask at a Trivial Pursuit question, what has been the average growth rate in the world economy throughout the last 50 years? 3.3%. All right, oops, they're impressed. The average growth rate of world oil consumption throughout this period has been 2.3%. So oil usage increases with something like 2/3, or the last 50 years, sorry, or the last 50 years has been increasing with something like 2/3 of how much the world economy has been increasing. And that brings me to the conclusion. And now I'm stating it for the last time, but it's very important to remember, there will be lots of economic growth, but it will be at a slower pace. So growth has slowed in our world, in advanced economies or developed economies, what we call them, and growth most likely will slow going forward. We will have lower productivity growth, and we probably also will have lower population growth in many areas of the world. But there will still be lots of growth. Global GDP, I repeat, will in 2050, according to serious studies, credible studies, be something like 2.5 times higher than what it is today. Historically, growth in oil consumption and the economy has been very highly correlated, and oil consumption has increased with something like 2/3 of what the economy has been increasing, the global economy. So if we believe that the relationship that has been there for the last 50 years between global economic growth and global growth in oil consumption will be there until 2050. And that's a big if, obviously. But if we believe that, then when world economy will be 2.5 times larger, yeah, then global oil usage will be something like 2 times larger. Is that a prediction? That's what we call a conditional prediction, because it's conditioned on the world economy being 2.5 times larger, and the relationship between oil usage and world economic growth will be the same as what it has been throughout the last 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jesper, for giving us very interesting insight and drawing the bigger picture. I should say we have about 8-10 minutes with Jesper. So if any of you has a question, please direct it to Jesper. Otherwise, I might begin, because you talk about, you said lots of growth. And I'd just like you to point out again, what does this mean for oil and gas use in Denmark and globally, perhaps?
Yeah. So, I mean, the issue is that when can I actually go back on this? Is there? Nope.
Yes, you did.
Oh, here we are. So I was struck by this, but what I was actually, perhaps in some sense, even more struck when I saw this is, look at the last 10 years, or the last 5 years, or the last 15 years, or what do I know? Even throughout the last 15 years, or 10 years, or whatever we think about as recent, I think this correlation has been very, very high. So even during the period, and I remember, of course, this is global. So this is not Denmark or anything, but this is global. So even throughout the last 10 years, where we have been talking certainly a lot about green technology and pollution and what do I know, and there's been this shift, and this is what you're talking about the whole day, and so on. But even throughout the last 10 years, the relationship between global economic growth and global oil demand and consumption has been, I think, very, 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 very high. Is that the same as it will continue being that going forward? I actually think you know that better than I do. But what I'm pretty sure about is a lot of things will have changed here. We've just heard the minister talk about that, and we heard the chairman talk about that, and so on. But down in Africa, they will still be depending on oil when they are growing, and so on. They will also use new ways of generating energy, solar, etc., but they will also be depending on oil, I'm 100% sure. So of course I don't want to give the exact answer, because of course I don't know it. But just looking at this, that the last 10 years when we talked so much about disruption, that at the global level the correlation is still so hard, struck me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think there's a microphone. And if you'd care just to stand up and say your name, please.
So my name is Ian Phillips from Aberdeen. My question really is about if you like, how you can use the history to project forward. I absolutely accept that there is a linkage between GDP and energy use. I guess my question is, does that really mean oil use? Because clearly, the two other big ones are gas and coal, and then I would say the globe is working very, very hard to find alternatives. So I think I can, next 5 or 10 years, I'd agree with your prediction, because we're where we are and we're producing what we're producing. 50 years out seems like quite a bold prediction.
35 years out, just to... No. Of course, I agree very much. Why do I show oil consumption here? That's where I can get a very long data series. For oil, I can get at a global level, right? At a global level, I can get a very long data series with oil, and that's why I then can use it in a graph like this. But I agree, of course, very much with what you are saying.
And are you satisfied with the answer? Okay.
I agreed with him, so...
We have a nice consensus here. Any more questions? Okay, I guess I have one which is sort of more basic. Again, seen from the economic point of view, what affects the oil prices, the way you see it? What will have an effect on how they are, on their values? Is that warfare? Is that disruption? Is that supply, demand, whatever?
And that was a surprisingly easy question.
It's to round it all off before you head out.
Because of course, it's simple to answer. What matters for the oil price is demand for oil and supply of oil. That's the answer. Of course, it is probably the most difficult question that he could pose. Because I can say that demand and supply, that determines the price. We know that from high school, basically. But the relevant question is, which is the one you're asking, of course, is what is it then that moves demand and what is it that moves supply? That's the relevant question. So the question, the way we should think about the question is there a war in a country producing a lot of oil or any other energy source, obviously, and it will severely affect supply, then it will obviously severely affect the price in the end. Where do we then see most threats and so on? That I think is actually up to a historian more to judge in that sense. But I think that's the way we should always think about this. Does it actually move the supply curve? Now I talk a little bit like we do out in business school. Does it move the supply curve? Does it move the demand curve? If the effect is so little that it doesn't move the demand curve or supply curve, then it won't matter. But if it actually moves demand or supply, of course, then it matters. So it was both very easy, but it was, of course, also incredibly difficult.
That's why we like him in the media, because he's making, he's upgrading our stupid questions and make them look really relevant. Thank you very much, Jesper. I think we'll leave it at this point, unless anyone has a final question for Jesper. Yes, please. There is a microphone.
Thank you. Hi, Jesper. My name is Bob Tulliken. It feels like today's oil price crisis is a bit different than it used to be. Lower oil price typically means lower cost of manufacturing, and you have higher, let's say, demand and cheaper products going forward. This time round, there seem to be more losers overall. Countries have less income, There are a few winners in the industry, maybe chemicals, but that's about it. It seems more doom overall and job loss than positive increases as maybe in the past. Would you have some reflections on that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So what you're basically, if I'm just rephrasing it so that I'm 100% sure that I try to answer it at least as precisely as possible, what you're basically saying is that what we have been used to throughout the last many years is that when oil prices fall, or the oil price fall, and then it helps economic activity, and we see economic activity going up. And when economic activity then in the end goes up, then the oil price will also at some point goes up because demand then outpaces supply. And this is not what we are seeing at the moment. We are seeing very low oil prices, a little bit higher today than a couple of months ago and so on, but we are seeing generally low oil prices, and we are not seeing economic growth. So when we look at estimates of what is the impact of changes in the oil price on economic activity globally and in other countries, these estimates, they are going down, right? So that's what it tells us several things. It tells us, this factor, this oil price factor, will not help economic activity as much as it did previously. But of course also tells us that if it doesn't, then we can be a little bit afraid that the low oil price will not, so to say, quote unquote, automatically increase again, because it is not that in itself that will help global economic activity. So the question in some sense is, there are two questions. Why has there been this de-link or less link between oil price and economic activity? And that is because we are depending less on oil, in some sense, right? As we are more effective and so on. And the second question is then this, why is there so low growth in at least advanced economies throughout the world? And I think we take that another day, because again, but I mean that is of course a big challenge. Why do we see this decline in productivity? Why have we seen this decline in productivity in all advanced economies throughout the last 40 years? It's a big question, of course.
Thank you very much, Jesper, for giving us some food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you.